Chechnya is under attack from Ukrainian drones in the third strike this week that is over 1,000 kilometers, as hollow posturing over ceasefires has left Moscow nervous for its Victory Day parade. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at the Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. As we're recording, Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, has been hit by at least 2 Ukrainian drones. Strikes in Hankala district, reportedly close to a building used by the FSB, Domestic Security Agency, and also unconfirmed reports of a strike close to the headquarters of Russia's 42nd Guards Motor Rifle Division. That is about 1,000 kilometers from the closest Ukrainian territory, and it comes after a series of these long-range strikes this week, a real show of force from Ukraine, and what President Zelensky has tongue-in-cheek, slightly mockingly called Ukraine's long-range sanctions against Russia. Also today, and slightly closer to home, we've seen reports of strikes on the Slavneftyanov refinery in Yaroslavl. That's some 700 kilometers outside Ukrainian territory. Also reports of strikes at a paint factory in Rostov. That's only 100 kilometers from Ukrainian territory. And also strikes in Crimea, one hitting a bromine factory. That's a chemical used in all sorts of manufacturing, also in water treatment and in the oil industry. So perhaps part of that ongoing attack on Russia's hydrocarbon industry. Russia has claimed that there have been between around 900 drone strikes, and Moscow also claiming some 1,300 ceasefire violations. And I'm going to come back to what they mean by ceasefire violations later. While we're on these long-range strikes, on May 7th, the longest strike this week, an oil refinery in Perm was hit. That's 1,500 kilometers from the closest Ukrainian territory. That's a refinery on the edge of the Ural Mountains, and it's important, that location, because the Urals was where Stalin moved so much of the USSR's arms industry during World War II, to move it away from Ukraine and Western Russia, where it was vulnerable to the Nazis. He moved it into the Urals. That was supposed to be the sort of safe harbour for Russia, and Ukraine is hitting targets that deep. That was the Lukoil Permanefteorg Sintel refinery. Also reports that an apartment building was hit in Perm. Suggestions that building may have been close to a factory that makes parts for engine aircrafts. 2 days before that, on May the 5th, President Zelensky said that a Flamingo missile had been used to hit a factory in Cheboksary. That's 1,000 kilometers inside Ukrainian territory. Interestingly, though, he said that missile flew over 1,500 kilometers, so 500 kilometers more than the line of sight between Ukrainian territory and the target. And that could mean a couple of things. We don't know where it was launched from in Ukraine. I routinely measure these distances from the closest patch of Ukrainian territory. And of course, it also means that that missile may have taken a circuitous route to avoid Russian air defenses. But nonetheless, all a show of Ukrainian capability. Now, I mentioned earlier that Russia was complaining about violation of ceasefires, the violation of a unilateral ceasefire. Both sides have posited ceasefires this week, and both ceasefires have come to nothing. And this is how it started. Last week, we talked about how President Putin and President Trump had held a phone call. And after that phone call, both of them claimed that they had suggested a short ceasefire. And that ceasefire was to cover the May 9th Victory Day parade. So we're recording this on May 8th. That is Victory in Europe Day. That is when most of the World War II allies, European allies, celebrate the end of World War II in Europe. Russia, the USSR, has historically always celebrated it a day later, and it marks that anniversary with a Victory Day parade, a major military show of force, soldiers, tanks, missiles, marching and rumbling through Red Square in front of the president, the Kremlin dignitaries, and sometimes leaders from other countries invited around the world. Putin wanted a ceasefire so that that parade could take place free from the risk of Ukrainian drone strikes. President Zelensky responded, well, we don't need a ceasefire just for your pomp and ceremony. If you want a ceasefire, let's have one on the 6th to the 7th of May to see if your offer is genuine. Russia did not abide or did not accept or honour that offer from Zelensky. Quite the opposite. They launched a series of devastating drone and missile attacks. Some 26 civilians killed and hundreds more injured. So there haven't been these ceasefires, and because there haven't been these ceasefires, what we see instead is these two capitals, Moscow and Kyiv, squaring up to each other over what is going to happen this weekend. Tomorrow, on Saturday, May the 9th, President Putin is expected to hold his Victory Day parade in Moscow. Now, he's already announced there's not going to be any tanks, there's not going to be any military vehicles. That's for the first time in years. Last year, there was only one T-34 tank to sort of symbolize Russian armor. Normally, you'd expect to see dozens of tanks, armored fighting vehicles, and of course, those sort of 8, sometimes 16-wheeled missile carriers carrying nuclear-capable missiles. And in a sign of that nervousness in Moscow about what could happen at the Victory Day parade, we've just learned that foreign journalists have been banned from attending. We will have to watch and see through the lens of Russian accredited state media. Russia's foreign ministry spokeswoman, Maria Zakharova, pretty famous pro-Kremlin blowhard as you'd expect. We've dealt with her before, reported what she says. She said that the foreign ministry has advised foreign missions that are accredited to Moscow, so effectively diplomats, embassies, to withdraw their staff from Kyiv because of what she described as inevitable retaliatory strikes. So they are expecting strikes on Moscow and planning a major retaliation. President Zelensky said what happens in Moscow for its Victory Day parade depends on the Ukrainian army. So both of them issuing very clear threats to strike the capitals. This is interesting because throughout the course of this 4-year war, certain targets have remained largely unscathed. There was very early on in Ukraine's long-range strikes, a couple of drones hit the Kremlin, but they were small drones. They didn't really do much damage. We haven't seen these Flamingo missiles, these large, powerful one-way attack drones hitting the Kremlin. And likewise, we haven't seen Russia's weapons, including either its hypersonics or its drones or its Caliber cruise missiles, hitting the seats of government in Kyiv. So that's President Zelensky's offices or indeed the Parliament building. And it's unclear whether that's because these buildings are too well defended or whether there has been an unspoken or a political decision by both sides not to target those buildings. Russia's reply: over the course of this week, there have already been 1,200 missiles and drones fired at targets across Ukraine. I've already mentioned that May 6th was the deadliest day, with some 26 civilians killed, 118 injured. 12 of those civilians were killed in Zaporizhia. That was the deadliest of the strikes on civilian infrastructure. Another 40 wounded, we understand. In Donetsk, another 6 people killed. In Dnipro, another 4 people killed. So all in that kind of southern-eastern region, but then also in Sumy in the far north and in Kherson in the far south, 1 person killed in each location. Outside of Ukraine, a couple of things worth noticing this week. The Economist has reported that Russia was planning to give Iran thousands of unjammable drones and train them on how to use those drones against forces in the Gulf, potentially against American forces. Of course, that is what Iran has been targeting in the wake of the US and Israeli strikes on Iran. Evidence of Russia's very clear willingness to target America and American interests, which is sometimes surprising given Donald Trump and the American administration's ongoing willingness to give President Putin and Moscow the benefit of the doubt. Also this week, we've seen reports of drones entering Latvian airspace. Now, Latvia has indicated that these were likely Ukrainian drones, but they entered from Russia. So what it suggests happens is that these drones went inside Russia, were presumably targeting some targets inside Russia, but for whatever reason flew across. So they may have been jammed, they may have been spoofed. It's unclear. Latvia has summoned Russian officials to protest this. They maintain Ukraine has its right to self-defense. a reminder of the risk of this conflict spilling into NATO territories. Of course, we've already seen drone strikes, or rather, we've already seen Russian drones coming into Poland, and we've seen it further south as well. On the peace talks front, on the politics front, Rustem Umerov, former defense minister and now Ukraine's chief negotiator, is in Miami for the first face-to-face peace talks between Ukrainian and Russian negotiators since the war in Iran started. That war in Iran, the American war in Iran, has rather distracted the American administration from trying to solve the war in Ukraine, the war you'll remember that President Trump said he would solve in 24 hours. As ever, if you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time. 3 to get through today. Where are Russian air defenses? It's a really good question. Russian air defenses are stretched and working hard because Ukraine has ratcheted up the volume of its long-range strikes. So that means Russia needs to use more of its missiles and more of its launchers and more of its radars. And every time you use a radar, you expose its location. That makes it vulnerable the next time. And we've seen Ukraine making successful strikes against not just radars, but against air defense batteries specifically. We've also talked, if you're a regular viewer of this program, you'll know that we've talked about looming shortages for Russia of its Pantsir missile short-range air defense systems. But fundamentally, what Ukraine has managed to do, it's managed to turn one of Russia's greatest strengths, which is its vast size, into one of its greatest vulnerabilities, because that vast size requires vast resources to defend. And when you're defending along a front line traditionally, then Russia has the sort of military conventional mass in terms of soldiers and armored vehicles to man those trenches, those frontline positions, and increasingly it's had the short-range drones, the FPVs, to support those troops as well. As Ukraine has developed this ability to strike much, much deeper, it's become that much harder for Russia to match that with defences, match the size of that area with defences. Question number 2. Is Ukraine still using Neptune missiles? It's a really good question. We haven't heard about the Neptunes much recently. They were the missiles that sank the Moskva. They will be lionized, I'm sure, in Ukrainian history, but actually far more of the strikes, particularly in the Black Sea, subsequently and recently, have been carried out with surface and subsurface drones, and that's where Ukraine appears to have invested more of its technology. But don't rule the Neptunes out. We may well see more of them soon. And question number 3, will 60 Gripen fighter jets make a difference, or what difference will 60 Gripen fighter jets make to Ukraine? The context of this, these are the Swedish Saab-made jets, which Sweden and Ukraine are negotiating a deal which will be Sweden's largest ever export, to sell between 100 and 150 of its most advanced Gripen fighters to Ukraine. We caution no single weapon is a game changer, but the potential volume of a high-tech, advanced NATO fighter jet, which can take off on short runways. That is some short and unmade runways. That's one of the great advantages of this Swedish fighter jet. It doesn't need perfect, beautiful NATO standard airfields. It can operate basically from roads, and that's a deliberate design feature so that these aircraft can disperse and take off from motorways, runways all over the place to make them much harder to target when they're on the ground, so they can stay dispersed. The advent of a large number of jets will, in the short run, increase Ukraine's air defense, because Ukraine is primarily using its fighter jets for air defense, but of course it does also use them for strikes. This would be a significant increase in its air force capability. That would contribute to the incremental advantages that Ukraine is seeking to secure across the battlefield. But it would help, it would make a difference, unlikely to suddenly turn the tide, reverse any momentum in one single go. Thank you as ever for watching, and if you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments below. Don't forget you can like and subscribe to The Sun's YouTube channel. If you'd like to follow more of what I cover specifically on defence, then do look me up and follow me on X or Twitter at Jerome Starkey.